Good morning. I'm going to tell a story about the places that we make offline. Uh, I moved a lot. I moved around a lot as a kid, not because my parents were military, but because they were young when they had me, and we lived in places that they could afford. So we started off in an apartment, and as their jobs improved, we moved from house to house. Mostly in Western New York, in that stretch of the Rust Belt between Buffalo and Rochester, where most of the farmers are from Northern Europe, and most of the people that live in the city worked in manufacturing and came from Central Europe. And everything changed for me when I was 11, and we moved to Indiana so that my dad could pursue entrepreneurship for the first time. He bought a business there, and we came home from school, and he laid it out for us, and we were moving maybe a month later. This was really interesting for me because where we lived in Buffalo, it was a really old suburb, one of the first that was built along the perimeter. The houses were stacked on top of each other. You know, we had postage stamps for backyards. It was the sort of place where you left your bicycle in the front yard. Lots of young families, and kids just had to be home for dinner. When we moved to Indiana, it was the sort of place where you indicated to other people where you lived by what exit on the highway you lived closest to. And every one of those exits looked similar. They had the same clutch of franchise signs. And they were often indistinguishable from each other. But for my parents, this was a big move. We got an acre of land. We had a little pond. We could even get a dog. And but in my dad's eyes, I could see that he had finally sort of gotten the castle that he always wanted, this suburban house. But for my siblings and I, it was bewildering because there weren't anyone to be seen around us. I felt very isolated. And at school, I didn't feel comfortable either. Everyone dreamed of having a pickup truck. My first slow dance with a girl was to a country song I didn't know. And but like all children, I assimilated, and I started subscribing to Country Music Weekly, and my go-to karaoke songs today still are somewhere in Garth Brooks' catalog. When I'd go home to visit family in Buffalo, I wanted to, for some reason, I wanted to. I was very proud of where we lived now, but internally, it was very turbulent. I began to feel a sort of neuroses of not really knowing who I was and where I was from. I didn't feel a connection to either place, honestly. I was too young to really understand the culture of Buffalo, and when I was in Indiana, I felt like an outsider. I can't trace why or how this neuroses formed, but around high school, I developed a very deep compulsion to connect to a place, and I wanted. This manifested. I started for the first time having fantasies that I would make a place, and as soon as I got an eBay account, I started bidding with money I didn't have on land in Utah that was for sale. And my parents would have to negotiate with the owners when I would successfully win those bids to explain the situation. But where I went from there is I began to envy people that lived in the places where most of our families had immigrated from. I really began to envy Europeans. I felt that more than us, they had a deep connection to a place. They, ethnically, they knew where they came from, whereas I felt like a mutt. So I became obsessed with genealogy and traced both of my parents' lines. My dad, his family had immigrated directly to Buffalo, and they all worked in factories. And my mom came from Belgium, and they immediately went to the farm, and both of those families have lived in the same place ever since. But I found the towns that they came from, and I was really particularly interested in my mom's side. And something very interesting happened. whenever I would find a generation further back in the pedigree, I would immediately switch to Google Maps and look up the town where they had come from, and I just began studying all these towns overhead. And then I'd switch to the next tab, and I'd look at the town where my mom's family in upstate New York. It's a town of a few hundred, where most people there are my cousins, and everyone works on some sort of farm. And I realized a vast difference in the characters of these places. It turns out that most of my family, who were farmers in Europe, they actually lived in what we would consider urban settings. They lived in villages that were really tightly knit, and the farmland would be a belt around these towns. And you would often live in the village and commute out to the green belt, almost because it was just the most rational way to divvy land. When they immigrated to the States, the United States used a plat system for divvying up land for new immigrants. So when you came here and you applied to be a homesteader, you were given 180 acres. And people would show up to their plot number, and it was on them to build a house. And you then begin to understand, well, this must have been extremely frightening and unnatural for a lot of people. They moved from villages to a vast frontier that was carved up arbitrarily into squares. And on these squares, far apart from each other, were houses that they built. And people moved into relative isolation. And I think it was during this time of American history that we developed the trait that we revere so much, which is self-reliance. We became a people that we came from a people that were heavily dependent on the extended family and the community, to a people who revered ourselves for almost being isolationists, for revering ourselves for doing everything ourselves. So at this moment, I sort of sought religion, not in the biblical sense, but I came across a futurist named Alvin Toffler. I don't know too much about him. I can't say the only thing I can say is that he was prolific. He wrote 14 books that were bestsellers, and the very first book that made him popular was a book called The Future Shock. And he theorized that when he wrote this book in the 70s, that there was a coming information age that would introduce variables into our life, and those variables would change so quickly that that nothing around us would stay the same for very long, and in turn we would develop a sort of neuroses because nothing was constant. And this immediately resonated with me. Just looking already primed for answers, I felt like I deeply connected with this philosophy, that I was a person that had already begun to feel the effects of this in our culture, because it's easy for us to move because jobs are so transient. We are not connected to a place, and for human history, place used to be so important to us. And then he wrote a follow-up book called The Third Wave. It came out a few years later in 1980. And this is the book that had really been my Bible for a few years. In the book, he introduced a term called the electronic cottage. He theorized that we would reach a day in which all of us would be networked, and all of us would be knowledge workers. And he believed that all of us prefer naturally, because it's in our lizard brain to want to do so, to live someplace bucolic, and that we would all live in these settings of very niche communities of people like us who were sharing similar knowledge, and the family would become important again. The family would be the working unit. We'd be sharing. The parents would be more responsible for teaching their kids. They'd be sharing their knowledge work with their kids, and the kids would take part in it. And it was a really, this was for me a really salacious vision, because what I saw in it was an opportunity to make up for the mistakes, to recreate a new nation of places. So that all culminated about 3 years ago, where I'm still harboring these adolescent fantasies of creating place. I purchased some land in upstate New York, and I set about to create my version of this. So I should state that I do prefer the wilderness. I think it's incredibly beautiful, and as a designer, I find endless inspiration there. But a rural place is particularly useful to try to build a community, because it's cheap to iterate there, and also you don't really have to worry about permits, which is much harder to pull off in the city. So I invited a bunch of friends up, and we lived in a cabin that was already on the property. It was about 200 square feet, and we stuffed all of our belongings into it. And over the next 3 years, we slowly first set our ambitions about creating really basic infrastructure. Of course, we built the hot tub first. But then we built a woodshed, and then we built a bridge to get across the brook that ran through the property. And then finally, we started building more permanent shelters for us to live in. And there was no speak of commune. The idea here is just simply that we're arriving at a time where all of us are unlocked from the physical resources that used to determine where you could live. Even if you were an accountant, you had to live in a big city where there were businesses. But more traditionally, you had to live near the docks if you were a merchant marine, or you had to work near the coal mine. But to a degree that's never existed before in human history, we are now living at a time in which we are relatively free, if we make it our priority, to live wherever we want, with whomever we want. And what's powerful about this moment is that most of us have grown up on the internet, and in doing so, we have participated in online communities that have taught us how to build community, and have unlocked for us the joy of being around people that share the same passions. As an anecdote, if you browse real estate in certain communities in New Mexico, if you go to real estate websites, you'll notice that there's a category of real estate. So, most places will say lakefront, raw land, townhouse. There's a category in these New Mexico real estate sites that say dark sky. And what that refers to is these are areas in their communities in which there is very low light pollution. Because what New Mexico is finding is that a lot of retirees who might have formerly gone to live on a golf course are now really interested in astronomy. And entire communities, there are now 4 that are year-round, that are self-professed communities for astronomers. And these communities have their own building codes that restrict building to prevent light pollution. And a lot of the money, the administration fees or maintenance fees, go to build common observatories. When I saw that, I thought of Toffler. I thought that that what he said was coming true, that our parents' age and the generations before them had grown up in this centralized, industrialized world, and all of that was crumbling down. Of course, it's going to be a very long process, but we're beginning to experience the age of the prosumer, in which we will not willingly just consume what is manufactured and marketed to us, but we're going to play a role somehow in what is invented before we consume it. And we're moving towards a point where we are not just going to play a role, we're going to I think we are going to control the entire vertical. We're going to invent and manufacture things we need and the places we live in. So Beaverbrook continues to be an experiment. People live there on and off when their jobs can allow. For me, it's been the happiest time of my life, primarily because it's allowed me to achieve one thing that I've had a hard time achieving anywhere else, and that is the experience of having a beginner's mind. And what I mean by that is to have to be with a group of people and to be doing something that that makes you unafraid to be vulnerable. And because we're so often living amongst strangers, and because we're so often insecure in the cities and communities that we live in, we don't. It's hard for us to behave this way. But when you're around people who speak the same lingo, and that's really important, who have made the same thousands of decisions that you've made in your life to get to that time and place, there's a sort of resonance occurs where you're just fearless, and you can try anything together, and you don't feel judged for it, and there's a level of joy that you can achieve that that can only come from being in the same place with people who share the same passion. So I don't have many more expectations for Beaverbrook other than I wanted to create a place of permanence that will always be there in my life, and I don't really. I don't expect my kids to want to stay there or for it to be important to them. I believe that all of us need some place of permanence that means something to you and people that share the same passion, so that you always have a place that's safe and magnetic towards of the sort of people that you enjoy being around. Thank you.